Good morning, everyone. We remind you that we are broadcasting live from the television studio of the Facultad de Ciencias de la Comunicación of the Universidad Autónoma de San Luis Potosí. We are hosting the first symposium on international research in communication, education, and technologies, the SIICET 2020. Today, Professor Henry Jenkins is virtually accompanying us, and we thank him for his honorable presence, time, and knowledge shared with us here today in our closing conference called Transmedia Speculative World Building and the Civic Imagination. Thank you, Professor Jenkins.
Happy to be here.
We also give the warmest welcome to the graduate students, professors, teachers, academics, researchers, and the general public around the world who are joining us today. Professor Jenkins is Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, Cinematic Arts, and Education at the University of Southern California, and he will bring together some key strands of his research process inspired by contemporary storytelling practices across the entertainment industry. His Civic Imagination project has sought to encourage communities around the world to imagine the future together through a process of speculative world building. Without further ado, let's hear from Henry Jenkins. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to be speaking to you today about some of the research we've been doing over the last decade through the Civic Imagination project at USC. This is work that's been funded by the MacArthur Foundation in the United States. And we have, as suggested, been doing these practices I'm going to be discussing in communities all across the planet. The work I'm going to talk about today builds on 3 books that I have developed in recent years with my research team. One is called By Any Media Necessary, The New Youth Activism, and that's an ethnography of kind of key social movements that are youth-led in the United States. The second is called Popular Culture and the Civic Imagination, Case Studies of Creative Social Change. And this book, or as the title suggests, case studies of the way popular culture has been incorporated into activism and social movements all over the planet. And finally, Practicing Futures, a Civic Imagination Action Handbook, which just came out this week and is intended for educators, activists, community organizations to learn how to put into practice the concept of civic imagination that I'm going to be talking about today. So some of you will know my book, Convergence Culture, Where Old and New Media Collide. And there I introduced the concept of transmedia storytelling, using the example of The Matrix as a film franchise, which also extended the story in the world of The Matrix through animation, through computer games, through comics. And the art of transmedia, first of all, transmedia is an adjective. It has to modify something. In this case, we were talking about transmedia storytelling. But increasingly, the word transmedia is being applied to education, to activism, to social change, to documentary, to journalism. What all of those have in common is a kind of structural relationship of elements across multiple media platforms for the purpose of creating a kind of integrated experience, with much of the burden of integration falling on the backs of the spectators / participants in that experience. So there's media produced in many different forms. It's spread out across the media landscape, and people bring it together again and reconstitute it through collective action, through knowledge building as a community. So that's the essence of transmedia. Hollywood has built on transmedia in more and more sophisticated ways. We can go from something like The Matrix with 3 films to something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe with more than 20 films, integrating story elements together. When we began to look at activism and young activists in the United States, we discovered they were following a similar logic. They described it as making change by any media necessary. And they acknowledged they had access to very limited media resources in their teens and 20s. And so they used whatever they could get their hands on. And that might include a variety of social media platforms, but it also can include something as simple as cardboard and tempera paint or magic marker, anything which allowed them to get their messages out to the world. And so we were very interested in the strategies and tactics in our book, By Any Media Necessary, the strategies and tactics that young people were using to spread their messages. And since that book came out, we've seen even more effective use by young people in taking charge of social movements around the world and using multiple media platforms to create an integrated message. Integrated and yet with diverse participants, diverse voices involved. And that's what's really intrigued us about this current moment of political and social change. Now, to understand the civic imagination, we need to start with the term the civic and think about its relationship to politics. This picture here by Norman Rockwell is famous as a kind of mid-century representation of the town hall tradition in the United States. But it hints at this idea of a shared set of norms, values, commitments we make to each other as members of a community. And these are social and cultural practices, not simply technological or institutional, but a set of values that bring us together, a set of norms. It's the foundation to which we return as we seek to resolve disagreements and work through tensions. And it's a capacity to work together toward common goals. So let's compare that with the political. And the political I'm defining as struggles over the distribution of power and resources, the formation of law and policy. So the political is more overtly partisan than the civic. It's the space of institutional politics, though it may also include other kinds of power struggles, such as those between management and labor, or between producers and consumers and the private sector. So what we can say is that at the current moment in America, and I think around the world, the frictions brought about by the political are burning up, grinding down the civic. That historically presidents reached out to opposing parties after they achieved election. The civic was the basis of trust in the civic process. There was a sense of restabilization, of reintegration of those who lost the election. I don't mean to idealize this because, of course, there were many exclusions from the community as it was understood in America and in many other countries around the world in the 50s, 60s. But we reached a point now, and we can use the recent election in the United States as an example, where while Biden seeks to reach out to all Americans, Trump refuses to cede power, is trying to sow distrust in the political process, and we're destroying the kind of civic underpinnings of democracy. So the work that we're trying to do is to return to the civic and think about how we can rekindle it by discovering what our shared values, aspirations, anxieties are as communities. So what we're calling the civic imagination requires us then to think about what is the role of the imagination in relation to the civic. And first, the starting point for us is that before you can create a better world, you need to imagine what a better world looks like. And popular culture gives us such vivid visions of what a better world might look like. So here we see a piece of art from the solar punk tradition, which is a school of science fiction, which is trying to imagine a future where we resolved the environmental crisis. It's a world where climate change has been confronted and mastered rather than allowing it to destroy us. It's a utopian vision of the future. But it comes with it, it is in itself a vehicle for exploring what environmental justice might look like. And the other world here is Wakanda from Black Panther, which represents a technological vision, a high-tech vision of contemporary Africa. And both of those represent attempts by specific groups of people to imagine what a better world might look like. A second function of the civic imagination is you must imagine yourself as a civic agent capable of making change. So on one side here, we have Emma Gonzalez, who was a leader of the March for Our Lives movement against gun violence in the United States. And she's famous for that bomber jacket there, which has all kinds of buttons and patches on it, which is a kind of gesture of multiple identities and of connection or solidarity with a range of other social movements. And the other side, we see a advertisement that was created in the midst of COVID to rally support behind emergency workers, using the metaphor of the superhero and the mask as a way of thinking differently about how medical workers are helping us during the era of COVID-19. Both of those are civic agents who see themselves as capable of making change. You need to imagine yourself as part of a community with shared interest. So on one hand, we see here an image from the Occupy Wall Street movement with the sign, familiar phrase, "We are the 99%. And note that the man holding the sign is wearing a Guy Fawkes mask, which in Britain represents a long-standing folk tradition of protest, but in the United States is tied explicitly to V for Vendetta, which is a comic book and a movie. On the other side, we see dancing in the street in Mumbai by protesters who are using Bollywood music and dance to express their collective voice during a time of political crisis in India. So again, popular culture is giving them the language through which they imagine and express their collective identity as a community. We also need to imagine a process of change. And here we see representations of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's Greta from the environmental justice movement. Both are demanding that we think differently about the future and proposing processes by which we improve future conditions for the human race. We have to forge solidarity with groups whose perspectives are different from our own. And here we see the Squad, which is a political group in the US House of Democrats who represent different races and different parts of the country and come together in solidarity. And on the other side, we see an image of K-pop fans who certainly have a common interest, but K-pop fans have increasingly shown their support for the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and are taking collective action in support of the struggles over race and anti-Blackness in my country. And it comes out of longstanding dialogues where K-pop was initially appropriating Black iconography and Black music, and Black women, particularly in the United States, use podcasting, blogs, and so forth to engage with Korean music makers and their fans in order to get a better understanding of race in both directions. So again, this is about building solidarity. For those who are most oppressed, this is an idea that comes from the Black radical imagination. For those who are most oppressed, you have to imagine freedom, dignity, democracy, safety, participation before you can directly experience them. So here, on the one hand, we see Palestinians marching through the occupied territories, shouting, "Sky people, you can't take our land," dressed like the Na'vi from James Cameron's Avatar films. And on the other hand, we see Hong Kong protesters marching through the streets singing, "Can you hear the people singing?" a song from Les Miserables, which is being used here as an anthem for democratic aspirations. And in both cases, they're expressing practices, performing practices that they don't feel they can directly experience in their home countries. So what the point of this is, civic imagination, is that in any society that has democratic aspirations, these ideals, these functions get performed by stories. And they can be performed by all kinds of stories: historical stories, religious stories, folk tales. Think about your own country and how we perform them. Thinking about my own country, I often am drawn to the statue of George Washington, which is in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., where Washington is wearing a toga. This was a statue made many, many decades after Washington died, but it expresses the connection that many of the founding fathers of my country felt to the classical world. And they wrote their pamphlets under pen names borrowed from Greek orators and Roman heroes. And they used a lot of iconography around the idea of restoring classical democracy in a new world. But the monuments can also be taken, are also dynamic in that they can be reclaimed by other groups. So here is one of the many notorious Confederate monuments in the United States. And we see that it has been that it is painted on top of it is the message Black Lives Matter. So in America today, we're in a struggle over monuments. We're in a struggle over how to tell our story or represent our civic aspiration. And many people feel that some of the monuments of the past reflected a segregated society that has to change in order to accommodate a more diverse American population. So across the South, it's a struggle between Black and white. Across the Southwest, it's often a struggle between Latinx and Anglo-Americans over how to tell the story of the settling of the West or how to tell the story of Texas. And these struggles over monuments are really struggles over the civic imagination as we understand it. Now, when we look around us, what we're seeing is more and more those struggles around the world are fought through the language of popular culture. And we first started thinking about that when we paid attention to the Harry Potter Alliance, which is an international organization of fans of the fantasy books by J.K. Rowling, which has, among other things, runs the Granger Leadership Academy, named after Hermione Granger, which brings young activists together to help them think about tactics for social change in the contemporary culture. And this year it was held totally by Zoom, bringing hundreds of young activists together to share notes on social change. And the Harry Potter Alliance has broadened out to represent a whole variety of other popular culture franchises: Black Panther, Doctor Who, Welcome to Night Vale, Pokemon, Star Wars, so forth, all represented. And these are study guides and discussion pamphlets that are shared with fan communities, educators, activist groups to create a greater social awareness among young people, particularly very young people, by tapping the media franchises that are so important to them finding their way into online expression. If you look at a contemporary protest, and this is the Women's March after Trump's inauguration, you will see more and more signs that reflect different popular culture franchises as part of the way these communities are expressing themselves. So the eyes peering over the poster there are those of Princess Leia from Star Wars. And there are many posters saying women's places in the resistance. And in front of it is a poster that says history has its eyes on you, which is a lyric from the Broadway musical Hamilton. So two different media franchises, one in front of the other, reflecting this kind of new mythology. And we could toss into that the pink pussy hats, which were a folk practice that emerges among feminist groups in the United States in response to Trump's comment that he liked to grab women by their pussies. That's another kind of mythology or way of representing the civic imagination. We've been seeing in this past year the culmination of a 4-decade-long struggle among Native Americans over the mascots of sports teams, and particularly the Washington Redskins sports franchise came together today. But we also see the civic imagination at play as we see groups fighting for inclusion and representation. And these are part of a protest of Native Americans demanding that their stories, and not just 19th century stories, but 20th century stories, be included in school curriculum in the United States. They want to be seen. They say the biggest danger is their invisibility. And something like a quarter of Americans believe that Native Americans no longer exist. So this is a group fighting for visibility because many people don't even know that they're alive. Now, my interest in this topic goes back to my mentor, John Fiske, who wrote a book, Media Matters, Race and Gender in U.S. Politics, which tried to connect popular culture and political change together, and often received a lot of controversy. It was hard to demonstrate precisely how these things were connected at the time he wrote that book. Today, though, politics and popular culture are being discussed in the same breath almost everywhere that you look. So these images come from the Pop Culture Collaboration, which is it's a group that is a funding organization, is funding all kinds of activist groups, educational groups across the United States who want to use popular culture as a way of shifting cultural attitudes toward a more pluralistic society. And as the other poster says, they're trying to make justice pop. At Arizona State University, there is a Center for Science in the Imagination, which insists that everyone has the right to imagine their own future. And they are very much involved with the solar punk movement that I discussed earlier, and how can they use science fiction to educate people about climate change and environmental justice issues. In journalism today, we're seeing the concept of speculative journalism, which refers to a variety of strategies where journalists are tapping tools from science fiction in order to help people envision futures together and the steps necessary to achieve those futures. And the science fiction world, we're seeing more and more writing by social justice advocates, often collaborating with science fiction writers to envision alternative futures. And this book, A People's Future of the United States, is one of many books that are exploring that shared space between activist and science fiction writers, using tools from speculative fiction. And we're seeing world building, which has been a tool of science fiction and other speculative fiction for a long time, being transformed into a tool for changing real-world communities. So the man there in front of the complex chart is Alex McDowell. He's a production designer in Hollywood. He's on the faculty at the USC Cinematic Arts School. Among other things, he developed Minority Report for Steven Spielberg. He is increasingly bringing experts together from diverse backgrounds in order to think through urban and environmental issues through a practice of collaborative world building. And above, we see John Seely Brown, formerly the leader of Xerox PARC, now an educator, a social change advocate, who's partners with Ann Pendle-Trujillian, an architect, and they do world building projects together, including one in the Yukon with indigenous people to help them think through their perspective on the environmental damage that's affecting their territory in the Arctic. So that sets the backdrop for the work we're now doing through our Civic Imagination project. Our approach is rooted in what I call participatory cultures where everyday people take advantage of the affordances of media to produce and circulate messages. They build on fan practices, which I've been mapping throughout my career. They engage participation, and they're committed to collective imagination and agency. So we have been doing these workshops in countries all over the world over the last 10 years, and doing a lot of them in the United States, both in so-called red and blue states, where we're trying to understand the political tensions facing the United States. The workshops, which are described in detail in Practicing the Future, the workshops, we've done them with everything from middle school children up through senior citizens. So here we are seeing a kind of children's drawing mapping a narrative that emerged from a workshop where they were asked to take stories that inspired them and mash them up, remix them together. And we found this process of remixing your stories really powerful tool for learning across differences, for forging that solidarity I spoke about earlier. And we've done it at the Salzburg Academy in Austria, where we worked with students from 30 different countries, merging stories from those traditions and learning from each other what inspires them to think about social change and civic connectivity. Another workshop we do involves thinking of the future. It involves speculative world building, where we ask people to come together and brainstorm what the world of 2060 would look like. Not the world we think it will be, but the world we hope it will be. And we do 2060 because it's close enough that we can still possibly imagine what it might be like, and yet far enough away that we can imagine we've gotten over the partisan divide, the struggles over power of our current moment. So here we see my research collaborator, Sangeeta Shrestova, in Beirut, working with educators and journalists from 10 different Arab countries. So they're building this world together, and then they're performing stories or narratives about how we got from where we are today to this better world, what the process of change looks like. And we were struck, as that picture at the bottom there shows, by the melodramatic nature of these stories, which were being performed in Arabic. And alas, no one on our team quite understood what was being said, but we could feel it through what was being performed on the stage, because the last phase of the story telling is that the stories are actually physically performed. We embody the stories of change through our practice. I spoke earlier about monuments. One of our activities involves us imagining monuments for a future society. We think right now the struggle over monuments in the United States is one of negation, different cultures negating each other's presence. And what we want to do is come together as communities, envision what monuments that include everyone might look like, and to begin to make representations of them. And this is a children's project representing a monument of spaceflight as something that they wanted to commemorate about our ability to work together as a society. I think they were inspired by the film Hidden Figures. We also want people to be able to share some fundamental values with each other through our workshops. So one of them involves memory objects, things that we hold on to from our past and that are deeply significant to us. And so we began many of our sessions by asking people to share memory objects and stories with each other. And we find that really breaks down boundaries between people and opens people up to be willing to share other things with each other. And we've been collecting these stories, mapping these stories, trying to understand what kinds of objects are significant for people, from pieces of technology like the typewriter, to jewelry, to baby teeth, to pieces of articles of clothing like baby blankets. All people use all kinds of objects to express and carry memories forward with them. And there's such an intimacy that's created when we hold each other's objects in our hands and contemplate each other's stories. During COVID-19, all of those workshops depend on us being face-to-face on the ground in actual communities. And often our workshops have historically taken a day or so of active work with that community. During COVID-19, we saw a need for shorter activities that parents could do with their children in response to media. So if you go to the Civic Imagination Project website, you can now find our Popular Culture and Civic Imagination Toolkit, which is a series of activities of speculative engagement with popular stories, particularly for children, that are intended for parents, for teachers, for community groups, particularly for families that are locked in together during the pandemic, to foster their imagination and to exchange stories with each other. Increasingly, though, we're thinking about how do we take the insights we've gotten from our civic imagination workshops back to Hollywood, which is in our backyard, being at USC and Los Angeles, and use them to create an approach that can inform media production at every stage. If mass media is going to be the resources out of which we foster our civic imaginations. How do we create a dialogue with media producers at all scales to help us embed better messages, more compelling and more inclusive messages for social change and civic engagement directly into the stories that Hollywood is producing or any other production system around the world? So we actually began with a partnership with media producers in Pakistan who had already made Burqa Avengers, which has been a very popular superhero story across the Arab world, where the superhero dresses in a burqa but fights for women's rights and women's education. They worked together, took our workshops to Pakistan, where they wanted to understand how Pakistanis thought about themselves as a nation. And even in Pakistan, the country is seen as not India, rather than having its own identity. And so the goal was to create a multicultural expression of national identity for Pakistan. And they did 30 of our workshops across the country, took the insights from that, and it's affected cultural practices in local communities, like religious celebrations, and invited other religions in to mass media production in the country there. So we're taking that kind of partnership out in other spaces. Lauren Levitt, who was one of our students on the team, has worked with a nonprofit organization called Improbability Lab on what they call the Regeneration Project. And they brought young leaders together from around the world to think about futures together. And this is an attempt to map the world that they built and the kinds of relationships that they imagine emerging from it. And the Improbability Lab just recently released this report, the Regeneration Report, which sums up how young people thought together about the future. An educator here in Los Angeles has created an imagination lab where she uses the Civic Imagination projects and along with technological toolkits to get children thinking about the future together and to envision their civic connections to each other. We've been partnering, we've got some preliminary partners we worked with on various projects. One was Univision Fusion, where we did a project at the border between San Diego and Tijuana, getting people on both sides of the border to imagine what's on the other side of the wall, and to share pictures and notes back and forth across the wall to talk about how they imagine forging their futures together as a kind of protest of the walling off of the United States from Mexico. Wise Entertainment did East Los High, which was a project for Latinx youth in the US that was on Hulu. And they now are working on a new project, and we are consulting with them on the civic imagination issues from the very beginning. Starfish is a incubator, an accelerator, where existing storytellers are thinking about building transmedia stories that speak to their own identities, but also speak against across identity politics about forging cross-cultural alliances. And we've been doing workshops with them on the civic imagination, and in particular on building fan relations as they roll these new media franchises out in the months to come. So that's a quick and dirty explanation of what we're doing with the Civic Imagination Project, but I hope I've shown a little bit how we're taking pop culture, which is increasingly fused into the political life in the United States and around the world, building on those practices like world building and speculative design, and doing so in a way that bring communities together. And now we're taking insights from those communities back to the creative industries and hoping to shape the next generation of popular culture and popular media.
Thank you so much, Henry. It's very